Jackson is 13 years old, a boy with a smirk that's too confident for his age, is being escorted by two police officers. His face is calm, almost smug as he walks past the crowd of stunned classmates. Some are whispering, others recording with their phones, while a few stand frozen, eyes wide in disbelief. Teachers and staff stand at a distance, their faces filled with confusion, unsure whether they're witnessing a prank or an actual crime. The officers guide Jackson out of the building, and the crowd of students is left in stunned silence. But one question hangs in the air. What would drive a kid to act like this? Jackson isn't your average 13-year-old. The moment you step into the high school, his name is practically a whisper in every hallway. You hear about him in the lunchroom, on the basketball court, even in the bathrooms. Always a joke, always a stunt, always a prank. That's Jackson, the class clown with a flair for trouble. The kid who can talk his way out of anything, charm his teachers just enough to avoid being caught, and slip through the cracks without facing the consequences. He's the one who convinced the whole class that the lunch lady was secretly a spy, the one who snuck into the janitor's closet and swapped the cleaning supplies for glitter, the one who put soap in the principal's coffee just to watch the chaos unfold. Jackson's parents, well, they've tried it all. His mom, Lisa, has tried to talk through his problems, but he just brushes her off with a smile. Mark? He's tried the tough love approach, hoping to knock some sense into him. But no matter how hard they try, Jackson remains untouchable, confident in the idea that he can break any rule and still come out on top. The school day had started just like any other. A few late arrivals, some gossip in the halls, and a handful of students whispering about their plans for the weekend. But then, Jackson had done something that no one expected. It started as another harmless prank. He'd been plotting it for weeks, sneaking into Principal Rushing's office, planting fake documents, rearranging things on her desk. A prank so elaborate that even the staff might question whether it was an accident. He'd done it for the thrill, the rush of it. The idea that he could pull off something so bold and not get caught was irresistible. But this time something went horribly wrong. Jackson had underestimated just how seriously the school would take his antics. As he was in the middle of the stunt, trying to tamper with the principal's personal files, the door swung open. Principal Rushing walked in, her eyes widening in shock at the sight of him. Jackson froze for a split second. The sense of power he had when he started this stunt quickly turned to fear. He was caught. There was no way out of this one. No quick escape or clever retort that could save him now. As he stood there, heart pounding in his chest, something else caught his attention. The unmistakable sound of sirens outside the school. The police. At that moment, Jackson realized something. This wasn't just a normal prank anymore. Jackson was about to face something far worse than a simple suspension. As the cold metal of the handcuffs clicks shut around Jackson's wrists, he barely flinches. The weight of the cuffs feels oddly familiar, as if he's played this part 100 times before in his head. It's another stunt, another joke. That's what Jackson tells himself as he stands there, shoulders squared, head held high. Laughed as he glances around at the crowd of students, many of them grinning, some laughing, all recording the moment on their phones. His best friend Tyler is among them, his face split in a wide grin. "Man, you're a legend," Tyler shouts, loud enough for Jackson to hear. Jackson smirks, feeding off the attention. He taps his foot rhythmically, his expression an exaggerated mixture of calmness and pride. The handcuffs, the officers, the whispers, they are all part of the act. This is his moment to show the world that he's not just some average middle schooler. He's the bad boy who takes risks, who laughs in the face of authority. This, in his mind, is what will cement his place at the top of the social ladder. Jackson, thinking to himself, but this is just a show. I'm the one in control here. The officers move to guide him out, but Jackson keeps his pace slow, dragging his feet for effect, hoping the crowd will keep cheering, keep recording. He even throws in a wink to a few girls in the front row. The way they gasp, whispering to each other, only fuels his ego. This is how it's always been. One prank, one stunt, one victory after another. Nothing ever sticks. He knows that. And today, it'll be the same. But something gnaws at the back of his mind, an unsettling feeling he can't quite place. The arrest feels too real, too serious. Jackson looks at the officers again, scanning their faces. One of them is unfamiliar. Officer Tess Lawson, a woman with steely eyes and a no-nonsense expression, meets his gaze, and for a brief second something in her stare sends a ripple of doubt through him. Jackson: "Hey, wait a minute. What's going on here? I didn't do anything that serious. You guys are just overreacting, right?" But Officer Lawson doesn't respond. She just keeps walking, her grip on his arm firm but not painful. Her silence sends a shiver down Jackson's spine, and he begins to wonder, why is this happening? Mark, his father, a police officer for over a decade, had watched from the sidelines for months as his son's behavior spiraled, skipping class, bullying the quiet kids, pushing boundaries that even his father's patience couldn't stretch. Mark had tried every tactic, grounding him, taking away his phone, even sitting down for heart-to-heart talks. But nothing worked, nothing reached Jackson. So, Mark decided it was time for a different approach, the kind that might finally get through to him. "Tess, I need you to follow through. Take him for a ride, show him the world behind the badge, and make it real. He needs to understand what happens when you don't respect authority. This isn't a game anymore. Do whatever it takes. Just scare him straight." The car ride is long and uncomfortable. Officer Lawson drives with precision, not offering Jackson any answers to his questions. "Where are we going? Why are you doing this?" he asks. But she stays silent, her eyes on the road. Her demeanor is cold, almost robotic. The police car came to a screeching halt just outside a convenience store. Jackson's heart skipped a beat. They had been driving through run-down parts of the city, but this was different. The flashing lights of squad cars bathed the streets in a harsh, pulsating glow. It wasn't a routine stop. Something had gone horribly wrong. He could feel it. Officer Tess and Officer Randy immediately jumped out of the car, motioning for Jackson to stay put. This wasn't a prank, a runaway thief, or a simple misdemeanor. This was real. The three men who were there to restore order to the panic room heard Jackson yell "Como," but didn't know what to make of it. Jackson's pulse quickened, his mind raced. What was going on in there? The idea that he could be part of it, even in the smallest way, hit him like a ton of bricks. He was still handcuffed, trapped in the back seat, like a spectator to something that was spiraling out of control. From inside a convenience store, muffled voices erupted into shouts. The sounds of objects smashing against the floor reached their ears, sharp and jagged. A voice, rough and panicked, demanded to know what was going on. Jackson's body tensed, as if his instincts already knew what the sound of chaos meant. Tess's voice cut through the air. "Jackson, stay here." But the words weren't enough. Jackson wasn't just going to sit in the car. He had to see it for himself. He didn't fully understand why. Maybe it was the adrenaline, or maybe it was the thirst to prove something. But he had to move. Jackson stepped off the pavement and walked slowly toward the cellar. The transition to left went smoothly. As the officers rushed into the store, Jackson's fingers fumbled with the handcuffs. His heart pounded as he worked to slip them off. The adrenaline made his mind race, his thoughts were a blur. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the cuffs came loose. Jackson took a deep breath and silently opened the door, slipping out of the car. He knew he shouldn't be here. He knew he should stay in the car. But his curiosity, the need to witness the chaos firsthand, was too powerful. He crept toward the store, moving slowly, trying to stay out of sight. The sounds of yelling grew louder as he neared the entrance. Inside, chaos reigned. The store was dark, only illuminated by the harsh neon lights of the sign outside. A young clerk, barely in his 20s, was on his knees, hands behind his head, eyes wide with fear. A man, a dangerous criminal, stood over him, holding a gun pressed tightly to the clerk's temple. The criminal's eyes were wild, searching the room for something. Or someone. In that instant, Jackson's world stopped. The distance between him and the gun-wielding man evaporated. He was no longer an observer. He was part of the story now. The criminal's gaze fixed on Jackson, his lips curling into a dangerous smile. He recognized him. The look of confusion on the man's face quickly shifted to recognition. He pointed the gun directly at Jackson, his voice low and threatening. "What are you doing here, kid?" The words echoed through the store, more chilling than any scream. "Jackson, I'm just..." The criminal stepped forward, tightening his grip on the gun. "You think this is a game? You think you're tough? You're part of this now, boy." His words were venomous, full of malice. Jackson froze. His bravado, The tough guy persona he'd spent years building shattered in an instant. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a stunt. This was real. And the stakes couldn't be higher. Jackson had seen a million movies about hostage situations, about criminals and heroes. But none of them had prepared him for the raw fear that twisted in his gut now. There was no audience, no applause at the end of this. Just him, and a man who was about to make him part of something he didn't understand. Panic began to rise in Jackson's chest. His whole body screamed at him to run, to hide, to get away from the barrel of that gun. But he couldn't. The criminal was holding him there, like a puppet on a string, and the only thing that could cut him free was the police. The real officers, not just the ones who had been walking him through his lesson. His hands trembled, his knees felt weak. He didn't know what to do. Just as Jackson opened his mouth to speak, to try to diffuse the tension, a voice shouted from behind him. "Get down." The voice didn't belong to Officer Tess, but it was close enough to make Jackson flinch. Another officer had just entered the store, but the moment was already spiraling. It wasn't just a hostage situation anymore, it was a standoff. One that was growing by the second. It was Teddy, the rookie officer who had rushed in too fast. His training hadn't fully kicked in, and in the rush he made a critical mistake. His gun went off. A deafening bang that rang through the store. The sound of the gunshot was followed by a shrill scream from the clerk, who flinched as the bullet grazed the counter near him. The criminal's reaction was swift and violent. He grabbed the clerk harder, pressing the gun even closer to his head, his eyes wide with fury. "You think you're clever, huh?" he spat, now more dangerous than ever. "You think you can get me? Think again, rookie." Teddy froze, his face drained of color, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he barked out orders, his voice shaky but authoritative. "Drop the weapon, now!" Jerome, a seasoned officer, entered, moving with calculated precision. He assessed the situation in seconds, stepping forward with confidence, his voice cold and commanding. "Step away from the clerk. Drop the gun. Now." The tension in the store was suffocating. The air was thick with fear and uncertainty. Jackson could feel the weight of every moment, each second dragging out as the situation teetered on the edge of disaster. And in that moment, standing frozen in the center of it all, Jackson realized something crucial. His life, his actions, his choices. They all mattered, more than ever, and the consequences were no longer something he could avoid. After Jackson was escorted back to the police car, the tense standoff inside the store escalated. The seasoned officer, Jerome, took control of the situation with his years of experience, expertly diffusing the immediate danger. Through calm negotiation, he managed to convince the gunman to lower his weapon, ensuring the safety of the terrified clerk. The man was apprehended without further violence, his wrists secured in handcuffs as the flashing lights of additional squad cars painted the scene in red and blue. Jackson, sitting in the police car, caught glimpses of the aftermath through the window. He saw the criminal being led away, his expression defiant yet defeated. It was a stark reminder of where unchecked decisions could lead, a future marked by bars and missed chances. Jackson thought back to the store, to the gun pressed against that clerk's head, to the moment he could have been the one with the bullet aimed at him. He thought about how close he had been to making a choice that would have changed everything, how one impulsive decision, one moment of curiosity, had pushed him right to the edge of something irreversible. His chest tightened as he recalled the scene, the suffocating heat of the store, the frantic, panicked air that had surrounded him. The fear had felt foreign, but now, sitting in the car, it felt real. Too real. And somewhere deep inside, Jackson knew he couldn't keep pretending that everything would work out by the sheer force of his luck. He shifted in his seat, unable to shake the thought. What if he hadn't been lucky? A soft sigh broke through the silence. Officer Tess glanced in the rearview mirror, meeting Jackson's eyes. The tension in the car was thick, the weight of the situation almost unbearable. But Tess said nothing at first. She knew what was happening. She knew the wheels in Jackson's mind were turning, slowly coming to a stop, the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. The boy who had once thought everything was a joke was now faced with a reality he couldn't ignore. Then Tess spoke softly, breaking the silence. "You okay back there?" Jackson wasn't sure how to answer. He had been so sure of himself before, so confident in his ability to get away with anything, but now everything felt uncertain, like a door he wasn't sure he should open but couldn't help himself from peeking through. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. Finally he managed to whisper, I almost didn't make it out of there. There it was. The first time Jackson had admitted what had been gnawing at him. The first time he acknowledged that his life wasn't just a series of jokes and careless decisions. The author turned a fresh page and began to write from scratch, starting with a decision to write in the journal. Tess's expression softened. You made it out, Jackson. That's what matters. But I need you to hear me. This isn't just about what happened tonight. It's about every choice you've made to get here. Every time you thought you could push the limits and walk away without consequences. But tonight, you got a real lesson. Jackson's lips pressed into a thin line, and he stared out of the window, his eyes tracing the passing city lights. He wasn't sure how to respond to Tess. The truth was, he wasn't sure he could even explain what was happening inside of him. Part of him still wanted to be the same cocky, rebellious kid who never cared about rules. But another part, maybe the part that had stared down a barrel and felt the cold sting of fear, was beginning to see things differently. The scenes flickered in his mind. His mom, standing in the kitchen, shaking her head when he told her about the fight at school. You're better than this, Jackson. Don't make us regret everything we've done for you. The stern look of his father, Mark, as he gave Jackson one last warning about skipping class. One of these days, you're going to take a wrong step, and I won't be there to pull you out. And then there was the principal, who had warned him after every prank, after every mess he made, if you don't start taking things seriously, Jackson, you're going to regret it. Now, sitting in the back of that car, Jackson realized how wrong he had been. Invincible was a lie. He had always believed that he could keep escaping the consequences, that somehow things would always work out in his favor. But the truth was clear now. One mistake, one moment of carelessness, and everything could change forever. He turned his gaze back to Tess, meeting her eyes in the mirror again. He felt a surge of emotion that surprised him. Guilt, fear, and something else. Something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Regret. Zena! I didn't listen, Jackson said quietly, his voice hoarse. I've been messing up, not just with you guys, but with everyone. I don't know why I thought I could keep doing this. Tess nodded, her face softening. It's never too late to turn it around, Jackson. But it starts with making better choices. Small steps. A little at a time. You can't change everything in one day, but you can start making the right choices, one moment at a time. Jackson's fingers drummed nervously against his leg. He wasn't sure how to move forward, but the words Tess had said kept playing over and over in his head. Small steps. That was how you turn things around. The police car continued down the road, the world outside passing by in a blur. Jackson wasn't sure where his journey would take him next, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had a chance to figure it out. And maybe, just maybe, he could start making the right choices, one at a time. When the car pulled into the driveway, the house was dark, except for the faint glow of the porch light. Jackson hesitated as the car came to a stop. For some reason, stepping out felt like crossing a threshold he wasn't ready for. But Tess's calm voice nudged him forward. Go on, your parents are waiting. He unlocked the front door, the faint creak of the hinges cutting through the stillness of the night. The house felt eerily quiet, almost foreign after the chaos they had just left behind. Lisa appeared at the edge of the dimly lit hallway, her robe wrapped tightly around her. Her eyes widened when she saw Jackson, and without a word she crossed the room and pulled him into a hug. The embrace was fierce, warm, and full of unspoken relief. Jackson stood stiffly for a moment, then let himself lean into it, his arms wrapping around her. I'm sorry, Mom, he whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Lisa pulled back slightly, her hands cupping his face. Her eyes, filled with both worry and love, searched his for a moment before she spoke. Jackson, you scared us. But what matters now is that you're here, and you're safe. His father stepped forward, placing a hand on Jackson's shoulder. "Go get some rest, son. We'll talk in the morning." His tone was steady but carried a weight that Jackson couldn't ignore. Jackson nodded, unable to meet their eyes as he shuffled toward the stairs. As he climbed, the exhaustion hit him in waves, each step heavier than the last. When he reached his room, he closed the door behind him and leaned against it, the events of the night crashing over him like a tidal wave. He kicked off his shoes and collapsed onto the bed, staring at the ceiling. The faint sounds of his parents talking downstairs drifted up, but he couldn't make out the words. His mind was too busy replaying everything. The criminal's gaze, the fear in the clerk's eyes, and the realization of just how far he had let himself go. For the first time in a long time, Jackson felt something he couldn't ignore: shame. He closed his eyes, the weight of it all pulling him into an uneasy sleep. The first rays of sunlight crept through the curtains, casting a dim glow across the room. Jackson woke up feeling different. Unsettled, yet strangely clear-headed. The events of the previous night played over and over in his mind: the hostage situation, the criminal with the gun, and the weight of his own reckless behavior. His body still ached from the stress of it all, but it wasn't the physical pain that lingered. It was the mental and emotional exhaustion. As he walked down the stairs, his father Mark was already sitting at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee. Lisa, his mom, was there too, her eyes heavy with concern. They both looked at him as he entered, the silence between them thick with expectation. Mark set his mug down and looked at Jackson with a level stare. "Sit down, son. We need to talk." Jackson took a deep breath, his heart racing. He didn't know what to expect, but he wasn't sure he was ready for whatever came next. As he sat, the tension in the room seemed to press down on him, the silence stretching out longer than comfortable. Mark looked at him, his face unreadable. "You want to tell me what happened last night?" Jackson swallowed. The words seemed to choke in his throat. How could he explain everything he'd been through? The fear, the panic, the realization that he wasn't invincible. "Weapons," said Buck. I don't know what to say," he muttered. Lisa reached across the table and placed a hand over his. "Jackson, baby, we've been worried about you for a while now. You've been making choices that were leading you down a dangerous path. We've tried talking to you, but you never listened." Jackson's eyes dropped to the table. "I didn't understand. I thought I could get away with it, thought it was all a joke." Mark's voice softened. "It wasn't a joke, son. People make mistakes, but not everyone gets a second chance. You're lucky this time." Just as the tension seemed to ease, the phone rang. Mark glanced at it before answering. "Mark here." He paused, listening. A brief conversation followed before he hung up, his face unreadable. "You'll need to meet with Officer Tess and Officer Randy later this week. They want to debrief you on what happened and the people you encountered," Mark said. Jackson nodded absently, lost in thought. That wasn't what mattered right now. It was the moment he had with his parents, the moment that changed everything. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice steady but sincere. "For all of it. For everything I've put you both through." Later that afternoon, Jackson got a text from Tyler, his best friend. Tyler was always the one who pushed him to do more reckless things. Pranks, skipping class, going farther than the law would allow. Tyler thought being arrested would be cool, something to brag about, a story to tell. But now things had changed. The text was simple. "I can't believe you went through that, man. I thought you'd be back at school telling us about how badass it was, but now I'm actually scared. I don't want to end up like that. You're right, we have to stop this." Jackson stared at the screen for a moment. He didn't know what to say at first. It was strange seeing Tyler, a kid who'd once laughed at the idea of consequences, now scared straight by the very same reality Jackson had faced. It was something he didn't understand. The dinner table was quiet that evening, the weight of the morning's conversation still hanging in the air. Jackson sat with his parents, their eyes on him as they continued their meal, the tension from earlier finally starting to dissolve into something more manageable. But then, Mark looked at him with a somber expression. "You know, Jackson, there's something I need to tell you." Jackson froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. What? Mark's gaze dropped to his plate. I orchestrated everything. The arrest, the ride-along, the whole thing. I wanted you to understand what was at stake before it was too late. The shock hit Jackson like a wave. The anger started to bubble up, the betrayal biting at him. How could his father have done this, played him like that? But then, as the seconds ticked by, as he processed the revelation, a different feeling settled in. He realized that, just like everything else, the plan wasn't about punishing him, it was about waking him up. I thought I was doing what was best for you, Mark continued, his voice low, almost regretful. I didn't know another way. But what if you didn't have migraines to control? Jackson's emotions were a whirlwind. He opened his mouth, ready to argue, but stopped himself. He could feel the truth in his father's words. It hadn't been about control or punishment. It had been about love. I'm mad at you, Jackson finally said. But I get it now. I don't know if I'll ever forgive you completely, but I get it. The next morning, Jackson walked out of his house, his backpack slung over his shoulder, his shoes crunching the frost-covered grass beneath his feet. It was another school day, but this one felt different. He paused at the sidewalk, looking down the street, his heart thumping in his chest. What if his friends, his old friends, didn't look at him the same way anymore? What if they saw him as the kid who had learned his lesson, the kid who wasn't cool anymore? He took a deep breath and started walking, one step at a time. He didn't know what his friends would say, or if they would even understand. What he did know was that he had a choice to make, and for the first time in a long while, Jackson felt like he could finally start making the right one. We all have a choice, every single day. Every time we decide to take a risk, push the boundaries, or ignore the advice of those who care about us. It might seem harmless in the moment, but Jackson's story shows us that those small, reckless choices can spiral into something much bigger, something much harder to undo. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more unbelievable stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Share this with a friend who needs to hear Jackson's story. Let's all learn from it and make better choices before it's too late. Subscribe to the program now at coweringtothestar.com, where you will find every week's episode listed for you.